Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to today's webinar, Best Practices in Grid Integration, Lessons for an ASEAN Power Grid, jointly organized by the Climate Change in Southeast Asia program at ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute and the International Renewable Energy Agency. I'm Jia Hui, your MC for today. Before we begin, I would like to invite everyone to fill in a quick poll with just one question to get your perspectives on the topic of today's webinar. So I have pasted a link in the chat to our Mentimeter poll, so please go ahead and fill it in. Okay, so just to read out the question, our question is, what is the biggest challenge to regional grid interconnectivity in ASEAN? Is it bureaucratic hurdles, lack of finance, regional instability, absence of political trust, or aging grid infrastructure? So feel free to click on the link, and we look forward to discussing your responses later on in the session. So while you are filling in the poll, I would like to go over a few housekeeping matters for today. Firstly, if you encounter any technical issues, please use the chat function to reach out to our technical support team. And secondly, to ask questions to the speakers, please use the Q&A function and state your name and affiliation together with your question. You can send in your questions at any time during the panel discussion. Lastly, if you would like to stay informed on our program's activities, do sign up for updates at the URL bit.ly/ccseap mail. So I will also put the link to that in the chat. Okay, without further ado, I would like to introduce our moderator for the session. Dr. Mirza Huda is lead researcher on energy here at the Climate Change in Southeast Asia program at the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute. And I will now invite him to begin the webinar. Dr. Mirza, please.
Thank you so much, Yahweh, and a very warm welcome and a good afternoon to everyone joining us for this webinar on best practices in grid integration with relevance for the ASEAN power grid. Now, we were inspired to organize this webinar partly by the strong push towards energy transition in ASEAN in recent years. So while ASEAN continues to depend on fossil fuels for energy generation, in the last couple of years, we have seen an increasing momentum towards the development of renewable energy projects. So in Malaysia and Thailand, we have the commissioning of some of the world's largest floating solar panels. In Vietnam, wind energy is taking off. And in Singapore, there is the commissioning of very large battery storage systems. So according to the ASEAN Center for Energy, in 2020, more than 80% of new grid capacity was from renewable energy sources. And there's also increasing interest in the region for sharing renewable energy resources through cross-border interconnections. The commissioning of the Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore Power Integration Project in June 2022 demonstrated the economic and political feasibility of multilateral energy project in ASEAN. However, given the enormous potential of the development of renewable sources in the region, we must move forward from the LTMS to envision the development of the ASEAN power grid. So the ASEAN power grid, or the APG, was envisioned as far back as the 1990s, and it basically entails the connection of physical energy infrastructures in Southeast Asia, as well as the harmonization of regulations and the integration of energy markets. And articles and experts often tell us that the ASEAN power grid can increase the uptake of renewable energy resources, as well as increase economic efficiency. However, there are a number of challenges, such as the lack of finance, as well as bureaucratic hurdles. And one of the recommendations that we often see in international papers and scholarly articles is the importance of exchange of best practices between experts based in different grids around the world and those in Southeast Asia. So with this view in mind, this joint webinar between IRENA and ISEAS aims to bring together grid experts from different regions of the world to discuss some of the best practices in grid integration in Europe, Asia, and other regions to draw out key considerations for the ASEAN power grid. So we have three very distinguished grid experts with us today, and I would introduce them one by one. But before that, I would just like to request all the speakers to turn on their cameras so that we can take a picture for social media. Great, thank you very much. And so we will now get on with the proceedings. And our first speaker today is Dr. Raul Miranda, who is a program officer at the International Renewable Energy Agency. At IRENA, Dr. Raul assists member countries in enhancing power system flexibility to accommodate solar and wind energy in different local energy contexts. He is a co-author of IRENA's Renewable Energy Outlook for ASEAN, the Indonesia Energy Transition Outlook, and the Malaysia Energy Transition Outlook. And this is a brief overview of all the speakers' biographies. If you would like to look at their complete biography, please refer to the program. And over to you, Dr. Miranda.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing this webinar and also for the kind introduction. I will quickly just share my screen. I hope you can see my screen.
Yes, but I think you need to, yes, it's fine now.
Can you see it yeah, okay. Okay, great. Thank you very much. My name is Raul Miranda, and I work on the Power Sector Transformation team at IRENA's Innovation and Technology Center. And today I'll say a few words about some key aspects of regional grids, and then also a couple of slides on this recent study that we did for Asian. So as it was already introduced, when we talk about regional grids and regional markets, of course, the main goal there is just to facilitate trade, and the main reason of doing that is that it really, or it can potentially reduce cost. So when we see countries since the past decades exchanging power, so initially back 20 years ago, and it's still happening today, perhaps the simplest way of exchanging power, it would be when you have a sort of exchange due to assistance in emergency cases. So that's something perhaps not happening on a continuous basis, on a continuous framework. So essentially, in this case, you would be exchanging power only when needed. So for instance, there are cases where electricity is made on a sort of a loan with no actual payment. So for instance, you eventually, a country export, say, 10 units of electricity, and then you can import 10 units of electricity in a point in future. Then you can also have bilaterals or multilaterals frameworks. So these are essentially agreements between countries and also between these countries, TSOs. As it was mentioned, you have this very nice example in the Asian, so the LTMS, that has been a successful multilateral power exchange there. Under this framework, a transaction price can be set differently every time there is a transaction, so every time perhaps based on the current prices in that exporting country, so you could eventually set that price, or you can also have long-term contracts, which means that participants know the price beforehand. So that will also reduce the risk for both sides. And then continue in integration, in increasing integration, and then eventually you can have, and as it was mentioned, I understand that's the, let's say, the general goal of the APG, the Asian Power Grid. You can have open markets with a central dispatch. The history here, what we have in terms of experience from countries, this really started with liberalization of power systems in the late 90s and early 2000s, mostly in Europe and in the US. And the aim there was really to secure and to ensure supply and to reduce costs by allowing these free cross border flows, and of course also enhancing competition. And then this has been changing, of course, and then in the last 10 to 15 years, there has been an increase in importance for all of these because this can bring additional benefits for the integration of solar and wind. And the reason for that is that you have assets behaving in responses to prices and on a given market time resolution, which in turn can reflect the power system needs. And then for that, you need to ensure that that assets across the region behave in a predefined way. You need, of course, common grids and standards. And we can see on the right that this harmonization grows in complexity, depending on the exchange modalities. So again, the reason number one of doing this for integrating and making regional grids is to reduce costs. And of course, eventually reducing some of the system requirements. So for instance, when we talk about services, system services, and etc. On the left here, we have some nice examples of how successfully and how the integration of having different countries collaborating together in terms of power exchange, how this has reduced their costs and also the reduce of requirements in the system. In the first case you have here, that is a decrease in the reserves. So reserve requirements here, we are talking about operating reserves. So this is not adequacy. So things like primary, secondary, tertiary reserves, or what they used to be called like that. And of course we have NSOE obviously saying a few words on that. This all has started with the German protocol back then. German TSOs realized that it would be just more efficient and less costly if reserves were procured together, and then you have it being escalated for the entire union. And then if you fast forward a bit, you also have today these the reserve platforms where you can share and when you can transact these reserves. And then the second here, you see that's a single country example. This is Denmark. This is one of the countries with the highest wind integration in the entire union, and one of the reasons you see that is that essentially through cross-border assets or cross-border interconnection, Denmark can tap hydro reservoirs in Norway, hydro reservoirs in Sweden, which in turn is essentially adding flexibility to the Danish grid. So in other words, storage availability increases when interconnectors are there. And it's quite interesting to see that the exchange between these two countries, or between Denmark and these other countries, are really highly correlated with spot prices. So exports from Denmark to the other countries typically occur when prices are lower and at moments of high wind generation. And then you have some other nice examples in Ireland, also some good prospects for Africa. Also in Africa, there has been some interesting progress recently with the African single electricity market. This is a framework that essentially it tends to have a single framework for the entire continent. These are 54 countries. These are massive and quite interesting and with very good prospects. So of course, all of these, so these benefits are essentially a result of harmonizing some of these markets. Of course, you can have a harmonization in one of these markets or many of these markets. You can have only harmonization in the wholesale markets. You can also have it for reserves, and you can eventually have it for capacity schemes as well. I think this was generally what has been seen also in Europe. You first have the wholesale markets. That's typically the first one that you would try to harmonize, and then of course going to a single electricity market. And then of course you need also to harmonize those standards, grid codes, and etc. that entail for that. And in terms of course, wholesale markets bring locational and temporal benefits. Of course, you have you make it more efficient to produce and to trade because you're essentially tapping the cheaper assets available across that region. And of course, those with the cheapest marginal operation. And at the same time, it also allows to allow this complementarity between demand profiles between these countries, also between solar and wind profiles. So essentially, for instance, you have places that you have wind profiles typically happen during the night, and then obviously you have solar during the day, and all of these things that they can balance out together, and of course, I'm trying to make a nice and smooth profile for renewables. In terms of ancillary markets, the point here is to try to expand the balancing area that you have and essentially operating across a larger asynchronous area. Essentially, when you have larger power grids, you can absorb more fluctuations, and at the same time, you have more resources available to meet your reserve requirements, and that's obviously also reduce costs. And then in terms of capacity markets, these are still generally still more national based, but you could also bring synergies for the planning. So in short, harmonizing rules among different markets improves flexibility in power system, generally by increasing the trading opportunities for market participants, increasing the balancing area, reducing costs, and of course, taking the advantage and complementarity that you can have from renewables. This, of course, all of these really involve a very large number of stakeholders. And so these frameworks typically require much time and effort to be developed and implemented. Of course, you have a number of points in terms of grid coordination, TSO coordination, and so on. Obviously, when you start, when you are aiming to start a regional framework, the first point there would be that you have physical interconnections which can be tapped and can be available to the market. And in the EU, for instance, there has been some endogenous allocation of transmission. So essentially, when you are setting the day ahead market, you already try to also bundle to it the transmission rights and how transmission would be available to keep and to enable that power exchange to take place. In the EU, of course, you also see these. There is a goal to have 15% of interconnectors in relation to the national installed capacity. So that's also a way to try to bring all countries of the union together and to encourage them to have the assets that would be needed for these regional grids. Then the second point here, it would be to have a sort of a regional mindset. I mean, given that we are talking here about a central dispatch subject to well-defined, commonly agreed rules, eventually you will need a central regulator. You may also need a central TSO representative. So in the case of Europe, it's SOE. And that also means aiming for the social welfare for the entire region. So at the same time that obviously you are ensuring that regions are better off within the regional market integration, rather in the case that they would be, let's say, operating alone. That also, of course, also requires a strong institutional arrangements and a governance to address potential issues that may lead to distrust among participants and entities. And of course, that countries can also proceed as a group in the case of scarcity, so according to established rules, let's say, rather than giving priority to a single country's local demand. And then, as I mentioned before, of course, for all of these, you need grid codes and grid protocols. You need to ensure good system behavior for also in terms of equipment and costs, and then there is also a direct relationship here with standards with manufacturers and so on. You also need to obviously have a robust IT for market and timeframes. So, for instance, when you have a central regional market, you have market operators that obviously need to handle orders from all these participants across countries, and to do it centrally, you need to do it in a transparent manner, and also you need to ensure a transparent method at different times and across different locations. And so, for instance, in the case of EU, you essentially have 7 power exchange platforms that are responsible for clearly generation and demand bits. That's only in the day-ahead market. And then you need to make sure that the market is clear, that it's a central operator that merges all these markets and implicitly optimizes cross-border capacities. And then you need a strong algorithm to essentially do these to set these power exchange. So essentially, you need very strong IT resources here. Here, just put some general examples. I know that we're running out of time. So, of course, these frameworks been around for a while now. The world's first international power exchange, probably it was in the north of Europe in the 90s, and then you have also the first regional grid code in the first in 2000 in early 2000s, and of course this was a collection of international rules of some of those TSOs participating in that grid code. In that case, it was the Nordic grid code taking place back then. And then, of course, you see, as it was mentioned, some similar efforts underway in Central America, South and Southeast Asia, and several African countries. So jumping here to a study that we did recently, this is we did an Asian renewable outlook and also a specific one for Indonesia and Malaysia. And all of these were essentially a 35 node modeling that allowed us to represent energy flow across the region. You can see the system representation on the right, and these were 35 regions across that region. And of course, then generally what you do there is you allow the system to generate and exchange power based on cost. So essentially, exchange can freely take place. And in other words, we are indigenously assuming that there would be an exchange framework supporting these, a market or any other exchange framework in place. Here quickly we can see some numbers for some of these some results that we had. I'm not obviously going through these numbers that you see here on the right, but these are for 2050. And then when we look to the future, we do see that together with storage grids will be indeed the backbone, of course, of the Asian grid. I mean, the region, of course, you have across, you have the continent, you have many archipelagos that makes interconnection quite challenging there. And of course, they essentially help utilizing the best resources from country and taking this electricity from to where is needed. Important point here is that we did see, we don't see the numbers here, but we did see some important milestones for the next 5 years and then for the next 7 years. So let's say for 2030, 2035, and typically these transmission lines may take a long time to be from planning to have them in operation. So 7 to 10 years. So that means that let's say this discussion and this planning really needs to take place today, because that can really take some time to be operational. Here we have a bit of a summary of some. This is again for 2050. The one on the left, these are yearly exchange across the region, and essentially you see here a typical net importers, countries or regions. So for instance, countries importers would be those regions like Java, Bali, and Peninsular Malaysia that of course will have and are expected to have very high demands in future, and typical exporters are just those with very good solar and wind resources. So for instance, we talk about Vietnam, we see hundreds of gigawatts of solar in Vietnam there in future. And of course, then you have, for instance, hydropower resources in Malaysia. You have very interesting resources also in Laos, Myanmar, and across the region. Really, I think all these countries can very nicely contribute with renewable resources and with the aim of having a renewable grid in future across Asia. On the right, you see a bit of that's essentially an average of what you could have there in terms of hourly exchange. So the upper one, these are exports, and the lower one, these are imports. And the interesting thing here is that, for instance, if you see the upper one, you can see Vietnam essentially exporting during the day. That's because of massive, as I said before, massive solar resources there. And then at the same time, you see these being balanced out by Myanmar and Laos, which are typically a result of their hydropower resources. So these two countries, essentially, they do the opposite. They can export electricity during the night and then import electricity during the day. So they are essentially importing electricity from Vietnam and exporting this electricity later on. And that's my final slide. I think I have 1 minute left. We also did in this study, we tried to see if operating reserves would be sufficient. So essentially the provision of operating reserves from renewables and batteries would be sufficient in 2050. We do see a very high need, of course, for operating reserves there, but the good news is that a combination of hydropower and batteries would be sufficient, except perhaps Singapore. Singapore, at least that's what we have in terms of results here. And you can see a combination of the shares for reserves provision on this chart on the left. And the very last thing that we also tried, it was to see how inertia would eventually behave in the future. Of course, the more you have solar and wind and in the system, the less you will likely have synchronous generators. So as a result, you have less resources, less inertial resources in the system. And we try to see what would be the result of eventually missing, for instance, a big transmission line there. And we do see some challenges, of course, but that's also a matter, I think, in future, and that's not only for Asian, in terms of how stability will take place in future. Of course, we can go to these through this, let's say, inertia pathway, inertia paradigm, but you will be eventually won't need inertia, and we will rely on some other technologies, so things like grid forming, inverters, and that are also likely to assume a leading role in future. So I think that was all from my side. I think I am 1 minute over, so I am just hand it over back to the chair, to the moderator, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Raul. That was a wonderful overview of the importance of grids to energy transition and the uptake of renewable energy, and some very important insights into the ASEAN case study as well. Now, we did allocate 5 minutes for some burning questions to Dr. Raul, but we are a little bit concerned about the time, given that many of our speakers are based overseas. So what we'll do is we'll just move on to the next presentation. And then we'll have a thorough question and answer session at the end. So our next speaker is Mr. Ioannis Theologitis, who is an integrated systems manager at the European Network of Transmission Systems Operators, or ENTSO-E. Since 2017, Ioannis has been working at ENTSO-E supporting various sections. He has been a main advisor for the Connection Network Codes Working Group, involved heavily in implementation topics, relevant consultations, and stakeholder interaction, as well as groups of power system technology, asset management, and research and development topics. Over to you, Mr. Ioannis.
Thank you very much, Dr. Huda, for the kind introduction and a nice presentation from Dr. Miranda as well. I'm trying to share my screen, but I think maybe Dr. Miranda needs to stop sharing his. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, actually, oh, yeah.
Okay. Now I think it will work.
Yeah.
Okay. I think it should be loading. Excellent. Okay. So hopefully all you can see my screen already. Well, let me take it from the beginning. Of course, a very good pass also from Dr. Miranda to give a little bit more context in terms of how things evolved in Europe. We're talking about best practices here. I'm not very all that I'm embracing the word best here, because there are good practices that work in certain regions of the world, but not necessarily are best for everyone. But nevertheless, we can actually talk about how things, at least at the high level, evolved in Europe. Just briefly, whom I represent here today. So I work at NSOE. What NSOE is practically an organization that groups together 39 member TSOs from 35 different countries. So we are not talking about only EU member states here, serving, of course, hundreds of millions of citizens. We are also like having 2 observer members, Ukraine and Turkey. So obviously the synchronous areas are expanding there. The NSOE serves as a platform for cooperation. So this is the key word here. Cooperation for what? One can say for anything around the TSO business, from the development, operation, markets, ICT matters, of course. Digitalization and ICT matters have evolved rather rapidly over the last years, and of course innovation. So we serve as a common voice of the TSOs, trying to practically work on certain rules and aspects that they support the security of the interconnected system, try to serve the optimal functioning of the system. And of course, the ultimate goal is which one is also what is now the ultimate goal of the Commission as well, to achieve the carbon neutrality by 2050. And of course, that takes a lot of different actions from many different perspectives and groups. So this is practically now the point that before we come to to the status quo somehow, how everything have been formed. So already Dr. Miranda talked about a bit of early 90s there, where the unbundling started happening with the first electricity directive. I'm not going to dive into all these points because it's really history here. But the point here is that there has been, of course, a gradual evolution of the regulation itself, right? And the regulation is important because it sets the rule for all the different stakeholders. And so it was formed under the third energy package back in 2009, together with ACER, which is an equivalent organization that actually groups all the national regulators. So both they were formed with some mandates, with some responsibilities and obligations, which those, of course, has been strengthened over the time, and especially over the next package, the clean energy package, as we tend to call it, that was introduced in 2019, with where again certain roles, obligations, and so on have been strengthened again to achieve the ultimate targets of the carbon neutrality. So in this slide, you can see that how the different obligations basically evolved. So when we first, when we were first created as an organization, there were certain very dedicated activities to be done. And I will start with the network codes because that was also the most known and the most important, let's say, at that point, task. There were connection network codes. They were the first ones to start, some market ones, and then operational ones. So there has been a lot of work around that, still ongoing. Of course, there were first versions already implemented at the national level. And now for certain of those codes, we are already discussing and approving amendment versions because things evolve, the system evolves itself, and we cannot neglect the new specifics that come on the table. Besides the network codes, there were other obligations on system development side. So the TYNDP package, for those that they know, is the 10-year network development plan that also has evolved as a document as such. RTI roadmaps, and so on and so forth. So you can see a little bit there the evolution. which actually brings us a little bit today, where when actually a couple of years ago, Commission announced the European Green Deal and everything that brings with it, which means that the ultimate objective is, of course, achieving the carbon neutrality. But in order to do that, there were certain actions in several different sectors: energy sector, industrial sector, digitalization, and so on. So what I'm trying to say here is, besides the direct mandates and obligations that the TSO community has, there are also actions that need to be taken in order to support the implementation of those regulations and plans as part of the stakeholder community, right? And here another representation of correctly tries to give a little bit in short, in a nutshell, the magnitude of work that has been achieved. And of course, everything to serve the competitiveness, the security of supply, and the sustainability. Here we are still far behind what we want to achieve, but we have seen already how large shares of renewables, at least if I talk about that part there, are already integrated in certain countries, and we have seen several cases of 100% at least instantaneous integration of renewable energy in the electricity, and which is of course happy news, but it also brings certain challenges that need to be discussed as well. Part of the whole evolution of the coordination among the different TSOs, of course, was also to look at things a little bit more at the regional level as well. I mean, the European grid is a highly messed grid, was already like highly messed even before the first rules and regulations come forward. The need for regional coordination appeared, even, and that was stipulated at that point from the system operation guideline, with certain specific tasks and services that those centers should have. And then, of course, there was this kind of creation of 6 now today regional coordination centers. It was used to be called like regional security centers. And those, of course, they appeared with certain initial services, capacity calculation, security analysis, the creation of the common grid model, outage planning, and so on. And with the clean energy packets, the third electricity regulation of 2019 that I showed in one of my slides earlier, these also tasks and services have evolved. So they are expected that those regional coordination centers, of course, they will develop new services and new methodologies in the coming future. However, just to show a little bit the complication of this regional aspect, just a quick one. So we can actually see the regions depending on, of course, on the service and the perspective. So operational wise, there are 6 regional coordination centers, but of course there are other types of regions. For instance, for capacity calculation, there are the system operation regions. So at the end, talking about the regional distributions and the coordinations of the different TSOs, the picture is a little bit more complicated than I showed before. A new layer of cooperation, I would say, that emerged or evolved over the time. It was also between TSOs and DSOs. So beforehand, we were talking about highly TSO coordination. Of course, there was TSO and DSO coordination at the national level, at least when it was coming to implement the grid codes and so on. But here, the weight to the impact of the DSOs and the DSO community increased, especially with the introduction of the clean energy packets, which stipulated the creation of an equivalent entity like ENTSO-E, but for the DSOs, which was very good news. it was also like stamping officially a good cooperation between the TSO community and the DSO community. And of course, this cooperation was, it aims to create value to the customer, to the citizen as such. So there are certain tasks that now, for instance, development of network codes that need to be co-developed. We are talking about of more extended data exchange for the enhancement of observability, controllability, for transparency regions. Of course, when we talk about flexibility, long-term or short-term, TSOs and DSOs are equally evolved into this discussion. And of course, when it comes to the market perspectives as well, how to best capture this flexibility as well with aggregators, suppliers, and so on, TSOs and DSOs, TSO and DSO cooperation is of high importance. That said, a few words, a little bit of where we are today in a sense of what we face today. So we see how things evolved so far. We knew the ultimate targets, but what practical challenges also we are facing today. So what we can, what we see as NCOE community at least, and of course it's not only an NCOE position here, but we can see also from other international organizations or not, that the future is going to be more and more electrified. So the electricity is the most efficient carrier for that, and that means that actually the economy will be more needs to be more electricity based as well. Why we see that as well, and what is the impact actually of seeing that, is we foresee the increase of the demand as well, coming either from the transportation sector or the heating sector. There have been numerous studies out there, either from international energy agencies or from different organizations, from the Commission as such. Everything, maybe numbers or final numbers or forecasts diverge, but at the end the message is the same, that we are moving forward to a more electrified future. And of course, more electricity, it means as well more, it can mean more grids, more flexibility needs, more coordination needs, and so on. So that's something that we consider as an introduced complexity into the current system and the future one. More and more renewables, of course, we need to introduce into the system. Those they are weather dependent, so we need actually to schedule a safe system also for the periods that we don't have much of an influx from this generation. So we are talking about how best we can capture the different flexibilities, either those coming from the demand side or maybe from certain other sectors like the electromobility sector or the heating sector. So working again more on the flexibility from the demand side, and how we best actually communicate, how we incorporate the digital layer as well in order to facilitate this type of exchange of, if I may call it like that, of flexibilities. So this is something that we are already facing. So it's not something that we expect to see in the future, but of course we expect to see it in a higher degree. And this is something that also captures that. So more and more wind is expected. I didn't mention it so far, but of course you may know the offshore plants that Europe has. And behind that, we will need, of course, vast amounts of new flexibility resources from whichever resources these flexibilities may come. We need, of course, a market behind that in order to enable the proper use of those flexibilities as well. And of course, innovation, right? So we need to see which technologies play which role, how, what are we still missing. Dr. Miranda before talked about grid forming. Grid forming is something that we have been discussing over the last 10 years, actually. and we still don't have a common definition of what grid forming is and what services they provide. So you think the technology is there. In pilot cases, it's being used, but it's not the most mature and trustworthy technology. We don't know how it interacts with the grid following technologies. So there are many things still that need to be studied, right? And all these things, and I think this is one of my final slides, we try to capture from NJE perspective in one document that we call it Vision, NJE Vision for a Power System for Carbon Neutral Europe. We tried practically to cluster all the different perspectives and challenges into those 4 pillars that we will need an energy system with higher degrees of flexibility. Again, I will talk about short-term and more longer-term types of flexibility. We will need to deal with operating future grids, and those future grids will not only be necessarily electricity grids, so we need to take into consideration the heating sector or the more sector coupling ideas there. Of course, we will need more grid. We'll need a more advanced grid. We need more technologies also that they support this grid functionality or enhancement. So smart investments as well there. Again, Dr. Miranda mentioned that the grid development is something that we talk about, but it takes a few years actually until we actually commission new lines and so on for the service of it. So we need actually to be very careful about what new infrastructure are we talking about, where we need it, and so on. And of course, as a final one, always the market layer there. I consider that more for a cross-cutting layer. How you can best create a market environment that all the appropriate relevant stakeholders can support all the pillars needed there. And this is actually the last slide, just more of a, it's not a heads up, it's more of a quick info, because in terms of innovations as well, we have been launching a few studies, position papers or technical studies that we try to scratch a little bit the surface, and in some cases even digging even into further of some of those challenges and new challenges that we're going to face. So in terms of, especially for sector coupling, flexibility from the transportation, electrical vehicles, or flexibility from hydrogen, for instance, which is something again that is on the table. I didn't talk about it earlier, but it's another layer of complexity, but also opportunity for services as well. In the electromobility, we separated a bit the heavy duty electrification because we consider it as a separate sector with a lot of impact that also can be directly electrified or indirectly in certain cases, maybe with the use of hydrogen. So this is a new study that will come forward as well. And of course, the power to heat exchanges and combinations with a high impact, of course, a lot in the load profile and a lot of flexibility potential as well. Either talking about district heating or we are talking about heat pumps and so on. So that was my last slide. Yes. So yeah, thank you very much. I hope there are some nice questions that I could address from the audience.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ioannis, for that really wonderful overview of the type of groundwork and constant communication and coordination that's required for a regional grid to operate. And if anybody has any questions for Dr. Miranda or Mr. Ioannis, please do use the Q&A function to pose those questions, and we'll try our best to answer them. Next, we have with us Mr. Akbar Wahyono, who is a research analyst at Power Fossil Fuel Alternative Energy and Storage Department at the ASEAN Center for Energy. He graduated from the University of Gajah Mada, majoring in geophysics, and from the Institute of Technology Bandung, majoring in geothermal engineering. Currently, he is working on the ASEAN Interconnection Master Plan study and feasibility study on cross-border interconnection between Indonesia and Malaysia. Over to you, Mr. Akbar.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mirza, and good afternoon, distinguished participants. Please introduce my name. On the behalf of the Executive Director of ASEAN Center for Energy, Dr. Nuki, I would like to present to you the opportunity and challenge of the ASEAN Power Grid, where prior to my presentation, we hear the great presentation from Dr. Miranda on the sharing regional grid experience on the Europe mostly, and then from the Mr. Ioannis on the share of the transmission system operator perspectives of the grid regions. And while here I would like to give you an overview of the achievement of the ASEAN Power Grid to date, and then the challenge that we still are facing on the region, particularly taking the lesson learned from the LTMS PIP, and then how we as the region will do the necessary effort to tackle these challenges. And for the slide, I think we can move to the next. Yeah, first of all, please let me introduce the FPG concept, where as the region we are having the aspiration target to have the one regional grid interconnection, where the pathway toward this regional interconnection has three different stepwise, where it should be starting with the cross-border interconnection, where currently ASEAN has the existing around 7 gigawatt of the interconnection capacity, which mostly are in bilateral trade. And then if the cross-border interconnection will also inviting to having more commitment towards the sub-regional level, where ASEAN has currently three main sub-regional systems, where in the North system we have the sub-lower Mekong countries, where particularly the hydro power plants are being transferred from the low PTR to Thailand, Cambodia, as well as to Vietnam. And then the South system, we have the Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia, which still currently only connected from the Malaysia to Singapore, where in the East system we have more scarce interconnection, where it connected mostly are the archipelago of the Philippines with the Borneo countries. And then ultimately we will try to integrate these three sub-region into one regional scale of integration, where currently we have the pilot multilateral portrait, where we can be as a pathway of this regional commitment, which is the so-called the low PDR, Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore, are known as the LTMS power interconnection projects. Next slide. Okay, by witnessing the development of the ASEAN Power Grid progresses, as of now, six interconnection are in the operational stages, and in 6 operation lines out of the 18 key cross-border interconnection are in place, and it could reach around 7.7 gigawatt out of 30.7 gigawatt total target for interconnection capacity in the region. And as I mentioned, that there are also a shared commitment among the 4 countries of the LTMS power interconnection project, which has been praised for ASEAN as the growing momentum to increase the commitment of the ASEAN member states. I think we can move to the next slide. So yeah, to enable to translate the key strategy of the ASEAN Power Grid Program area, one of the flagship study of the ASEAN Center for Energy has been conducted. It's so-called the ASEAN Interconnection Master Plan Study, or AIMS-3. This study aims to set out the transmission infrastructure needed to support the multilateral power trade in ASEAN, as well as to increase the renewable energy integration into the ASEAN power grid. As AIMS-3 also embodies the ASEAN Ministerial Directive to explore the feasibility of multilateral electricity trading, as well as to enhance grid resilience and modernization of the grid, and to provide the affordable and resiliency of the electricity supply, as well as to provide the high share of renewable into the grid system. Where you can see that, still in this slide, where you can see that we have aspiration to connect these 3 sub-regional grid from the northern connected to the southern region, and then from the southern we connect Java to Kalimantan through the subsea cables, and then the southern to the northern from the Sarawak to Malaysia, and we still have some challenges in terms of the geographical challenge, as currently there are HVDC subsea line existing in the region. So one of the challenges that we may need to tackle the first is how to allow the subsea cables are technically and economically viable for the ASEAN case. Next slide, please. And this is one of the key milestone achievement of the ASEAN in terms of the regional grid integration, where the LTM-SPIP has been referred to the pilot of the multilateral power trade, involving the LPDR as a seller, Thailand and Malaysia as the wheeler, and Singapore as the buyer. So you may see that the 100 megawatt of the hydropower are evacuated through Thailand, in Malaysia, all the way to Singapore, where it's the development of this power interconnection project through three important stages. First, that the embryo of this four countries commitment is coming from the LTM, the Laos, Thailand, and Malaysia, through phase 1, where it was through the 100 megawatt transfer of hydro power from Laos to Thailand and all the way to Malaysia. And then the second phase, the power purchase was increased up to 300 megawatt, and then the latest stage is the LTM-SPIP, where it was commenced in the 22nd June on 2022, where as of 30 April 2023, the total electricity has been traded is around 264 gigawatt hours, and this has been highlighted as the growing momentum for the ASEAN member state, as Singapore also proposing for the next phases of LTMS to increase the power purchase agreement with the LPDR. I think we can go to the next slide. As the electricity import of the Singapore from the LPDR has made up 1.5% of Singapore peak electricity demand, and as of the 2023, the total of electricity being traded is quite large so far, and And with this number, it proves that the project is both technically and economically feasible to trade electricity across the long distance, as well as to involving the 4 different government entities, as well as from the utilities itself. And it also showcased that the connection is beneficial to all the parties involved. And by considering the complexity of the deal involving the 4 government and the entities, the success has been received the appreciation of the many, as the publicity of this accomplishment has been celebrated during the 14th ASEAN Ministry of Energy meeting in September last year. And how do the ASEAN member states should use this momentum to build upon the success of the LTMS. And first, we should take a look at the key driver of this achievement, which is the strong intergovernmental support and the cooperation that has been identified as the major push for this successful projects. I think we can go to the next slide. And the second takeaway of the LTMS BIP is that its ability to manage and to overcome the challenges that has encountered during the formation of the project, as that as well the fact that the LTMS country also dealing with their own challenges in terms of completing this project. However, by the establishment of the working group, by this also being shared together, particularly in dealing with the technical, regulatory, commercial, and the tariff issues. In terms of the challenge itself, the respective country law PTR as the energy importer has the challenge on the diversification of the sources, as during the dry season, their dams or their hydropower haven't been able to deliver the full generation capacity. Well, their national grid as well is still in the process of the strengthening to allow more diversified resource. So this is quite a challenge for the country to keep up the request of the power export from the neighboring countries. And then meanwhile, the Thailand and Malaysia, as a wheeling country, also face a challenge in quantifying the value of the wheeling charges, also into the granting the third-party access of the national property of the transmission system, and then translating them into the legal document which require the agreement from the 4 different parties. And as the result that this project has been successful to evacuate the electron from the low PDR all the way to Singapore with 110 kilometer long 300 kV HVDC power line between Thailand and Malaysia has been served as the highway for this cross-border multi-cross-border electricity transfers. This also cite that the institutional arrangement has been also challenged, not to mention the geopolitical challenge of the countries that has to be addressed in balance with the trade-off between independency and the sovereignty of the energy security. And this has been a tremendous effort by these 4 nations. I think we can go to the next slide. And by looking at the current situation, the LTMS BIP should be a pathfinder project that is meant to demonstrate the multilateral co-trading is possible for the ASEAN context by building upon the efforts of the successful LTMS, as it already has the requirement of the if already consists of the minimum requirement for multilateral portrait to be existing. First of all, being there will be already the billing charges methodology. There also have been harmonized seeing the grid codes among these four utilities, and institutionally as well. The process of developing this power interconnection project has also been constructive, as it's already involved the establishment of the spirit working group and task forces. And then going to the next slide. And how do we exactly do the overcoming the challenge that has been existing throughout the establishment of the APG? First, we propose these four stepwise of the plan where we can able to move the planning stage of the APG into the implementation, as we see that it will require a roadmap as well as its financial framework to set the direction and enable the regional institution to pursue a systematic solution through coordinated decision-making process. First, that output is to have the all relevant stakeholders are gathered together to ensure that the timely decision making is quite in time to reach the implementation stage. And then the output two is to have the analytic work to identify the required market analysis, regulatory, financials, environmental, and so on and so forth to on the minimum requirement to establish the implementation of the ASEAN Power Grid. And then the most importantly is to have the roadmap and financial framework to provide the coherent and central coordination tool for the relevant stakeholders in the ASEAN and the coordinating agency to identify the financing needs for the planning studies and as well as the finding projects to provide the common comprehensive financial framework for whether it is from the public or private sources of the funding. And then lastly, the output four, where to foster the concrete step toward the implementation of the FPG, we propose to have the implementation of the pilot project, where we also be able to conduct the pre-feasibility study and feasibility study until the pilot project being done. And then I think I'm able to go to the latest slide of my presentation. And this is the another concrete step that ACE has been currently engaging with the head of ASEAN Power Utilities of Authorities, or we call it the APUA. The 10 utilities are grouping together to share the common goal of integrating each other and towards the multilateral power trade, where the feasibility study itself are aim to explore the economic, regulation, and technical, social, as well as the environmental viability of the transmission infrastructure. And this is the follow-up effort towards the implementation of FPG, towards the follow-up effort towards the result of the master plan study that we have conducted earlier, to be followed up with more detailed feasibility study which aim to foster the development of FPG, particularly in the investment aspect. And for this, ACE has been engaged with the APUA utility members, as well as with the development agency and the technical expertise from the worldwide to able to work together to get this thing to get this thing done by, and also by guided by the senior official on the energy, as well as the ASEAN ministerial meeting of energy. I think this is all for me. Thank you very much. I would be happy to answer any questions. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Akbar. That was a very concise and informative overview of the progress of the APG and the various challenges and opportunities involved in this very complex project. So we have quite a few questions for our speakers, but before I set off the question and answer session, I think it would be interesting to share the findings of the Mentimeter survey that we asked our participants to fill out before our the beginning of our webinar. So if you can just put up the results up on the screen, then we can possibly get feedback from each of our speakers. So the question, sorry, it just disappeared. So the question that we asked our audience is, what is the biggest challenge to regional grid interconnectivity in ASEAN? And the most popular challenge identified has been, well, the largest challenge that has been identified has been bureaucratic hurdles, followed by the lack of political trust, and then the lack of finance. And then we received some responses for aging grid infrastructure as an impediment, and not many people think regional instability is an issue. So the top three challenges, according to our audience, is bureaucratic hurdles, the absence of political trust, and lack of finance. So it would be really wonderful if I can get some brief comments from each of our speakers on the results of this survey and whether this actually holds true from a global perspective, a European perspective, and a Southeast Asian perspective. So we'll start off with some comments from Dr. Miranda, followed by Mr. Ioannis, and then Mr. Akbar.
Yes, thank you very much. I think the poll went out. I can't see it anymore, but I think some of the points were bureaucracy, right, and then financial bureaucracy. I'm not sure I would call it bureaucracy, because I think bureaucracy, when the word is that I understand it that you are creating more processes and more hurdles that what would be needed. But I think the point when you're creating a regional grid is that you really are involved in many different stakeholders. You're involved in many different, so essentially you are involved in all TSOs, market participants, eventually country representatives for each of the countries that are part of your system. And then you also have those central institutions for TSOs, regulators, and then before all of it, you need also to, of course, deploy those cross-border interconnections. These takes time as well. So all of these are a part of essentially a number and a range of different negotiations, of course, with different aspects and benefits and disadvantages as well, of course, in all of these. So this really takes time. So I think that would be, it's indeed, I think, a very important challenge in deploying a power system. I just wouldn't call it bureaucracy. I think perhaps that won't be the case for all the regional grids. Then the second one, I don't remember anymore. Sorry, I didn't take note of it. But obviously, financial, it's obviously an important one. But I do think that we've seen more and more international collaboration also in supporting these regional grids. So, for instance, if we take the African single electricity market, this is a framework that has been in progress, and there has been some quite thanks quite of a good progress recently. And the market there has been built taking a very good experience from the European market, and actually there has been European actors really, and the EU itself really supporting those actors there. And of course, this goes to processes, the way you develop those frameworks, the market granularity, the different market products that you can have. Of course, you can have energy, but at some point you also have those reserve requirements. At some point, there has been also said in some markets that eventually at some point you may have also a market for inertia and so on. So all of these are things that are quite important, and we've seen some very nice international collaboration on that. Political trust, yeah, I think that's a quite important one, because we do see some countries that are still not, I think, super comfortable in relying neighbors for such a very important commodity. And at the same time, you may, since you're of course opening the market, you're increasing competition as well. And that means that nationally or at the national level, there might be some power plant facilities or power plant involved actors that are going, of course, to some extent to let's say, to participate in the market to a lesser extent. And then, of course, from the view of these actors, that's perhaps not something, at least in the short term, something super good. So, of course, there are some barriers and some discussions on that in terms of sovereignty and national assets as well. And then the last one, I think, a green or a grid infrastructure. I think that's something that it's really a result of regional studies. So essentially, what you would like to try there is to really tap your renewable resources that you have across a region. So when we, I think I went too fast on that, but when we see a region like Southeast Asia, you do see quite interestingly solar resources. So for instance, in some specific areas, and then at the same time, complementary way, you have hydropower resources, you have geothermal in some regions. So all of these, of course, these have different profiles, these have different availabilities, and at the same time, obviously, you also have the main load centers across that region. So all of these interaction, I think that would eventually entail agreeing in some sort of grid infrastructure, but I don't see that as a super a major barrier. I think that's something, of course, you need to agree. But if you have a fundamental and a comprehensive study, of course, backing up your discussion, I don't think that those actors involved would oppose to that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Miranda. That was a very informative critique of the results we have up here. And next we have Mr. Ioannis. I was wondering if he could just give us a quick insight into how the results of this Mentimeter survey relate to the situation that we have in Europe.
They do. I wouldn't call it, again, also bureaucratic. Maybe it's something that can be misunderstood in a way. But for me, there are two main components here: is the political will and the coordination. If you have this, and especially the political will, you can adjust your bureaucratic processes. Maybe at the beginning, it will be, there will be some inertia there, but then you can adjust. You can secure your financing, you can facilitate your processes, and so on and so forth. So for me, the political will, the kind of the regulatory framework or some sort of governance there, in agreement, it will basically open the door for anything. I mean, obviously, this is not a technical problem only. The technicality comes afterwards, and usually engineers and the technical aspects are being solved much easier than anything else, right? So I think having the security that what you want to do benefits, serves your goals, benefits all the countries involved, respects the different, even cultural differences of those countries, respects the level of maturity that is different in each country, right? Even in terms of technology, in terms of innovation, in terms of implementation, in terms of everything. So as soon as you reach that level, which is the most fundamental one, all the other layers there, they can be reduced. Obviously, there will always be hurdles on the way, even technical ones. Some studies, some financial issues, some blocks, some obstacles that are always on the table there. But many of those things, you learn as you go. But you will never go until you have the security of the political intention, at least, to do this. And I think this is how it worked in Europe as well, a collection of many different countries and many different cultures to a certain extent. And this helped, EU laws that actually respected by your countries. And then it slowly, again, at the beginning, starting moving forward. Now it moves even faster. In certain cases, you learn, you adapt, you improve, and you go forward. So nothing really, I don't see anything that I'm surprised, honestly, apart from the bureaucratic that I mainly put it, again, I put more the political flavor in this column than actually the process itself,
Thank you, Mr. Ioannis. Indeed, the issue of political will always comes up as a barrier in energy integration in all Asian countries. It's interesting to see that it also resonates in the European context as well. Whenever we read literature, we see that technical issues are not necessarily a barrier. It's more of the issue of political will. Next, we have Mr. Akbar, and if you could kindly give us some insights into how these challenges resonate in the context of the APG, or if there are other challenges that are actually not mentioned here.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Mirza. And this is very interesting poll that we have here. Most of, I say that from my experience working with the utilities to advocate them to have the regional integration. This is I'd say that the top three of these are currently happening in the ASEAN. First, I'd like to talk about the bureaucratic hurdles. Perhaps it may be misunderstood by many, but in my opinion, this relates to the institutional framework within the ASEAN itself, as is now that although we haven't yet as mature as European systems, but we have this kind of the embryo of the institutional framework that we have in the ASEAN context, where we have currently we have three APG related bodies which hand in hand to able to achieve the multilateral power trade. I'd say that first one is the HAPUA, Head of Authorities and Power Utilities. The 10 ASEAN member state utilities are gathering together to share their common goals. They are the technical team who handle the challenge of the technical, and while we also have the ASEAN regulatory network, or we so-called the IRENA, they have the task to harmonizing the regulatory for the to implement the multilateral power trade, where in the more higher hierarchy we have the APGCC, or we call it the ASEAN Power Grid Consultative Council, where they provide the policy making or the decision making to able to expedite the process of the APG. And by that, these three institutional bodies have been worked hand in hand to promote this multilateral trade to happen in the ASEAN. And currently, there are still many still not understanding what is who to do what, although they're still not clear on the detail on what to achieve that this is the still learning process for these three institutional framework to do their job responsibility in the full capacity. And the second hurdle, we see that resonate well with the ASEAN context is the lack of the investment, because most of the ASEAN interconnection projects are more funded by the state-owned enterprises or from the government or from the government or finance, and generally it integrated utilities, where by our estimation that it should be the private sector will close the gap for the required investment needed in the ASEAN. This also should be followed by the regulatory framework, which allow the interconnection project will be funded by the private sectors, and also the accessible to the fund itself still limited because however, this is something that interesting enough that energy transition are now everyone already aware it could not be happening without the transmission network to able to effectuate the renewable energy from one point to another point, and which also allow the financial institution to have their budget to spread to these interconnection projects. And the latest one is the absence of the political trust. I'd say it also resonates well in the ASEAN context, where most of the, some country in the ASEAN is still really have the tendency to secure their energy security within the country itself, or we call it the energy sovereignty, rather than having the interdependency issue with the other neighboring countries, which reflected to the country from the southern region, because this also relate to the geographical challenge in the southern of the ASEAN, where we see the Indonesia have the archipelagos should be hurdle to connect with the mainland of the ASEAN, so they are quite challenging for them to connect. I think that's how should I react on this result of the poll.
Thank you, Mr. Akbar. Yes, indeed, energy sovereignty and resource nationalism, as well as coordination between different organizations, it remains quite difficult in the context of ASEAN, despite the enormous potential you also talked about. So now I would open up the floor for questions. We have actually received many questions from our audience, and I would just start off with Dr. Miranda. So we have several questions, and I will combine them together so it's easier for Dr. Miranda to answer. So one of the questions is whether the ASEAN Power Grid can potentially be expanded to countries such as China or Australia, and whether it is technically and politically feasible. And we have another question regarding the slide where Dr. Miranda showed net electricity imports and exports during the day and during the night, and the various types of powers involved, such as hydropower and solar. So I will just get Dr. Miranda to answer these two questions and then go on to the next speaker.
Yes, thank you very much. So for the first one, the question would be how ASEAN could eventually, of course, connect to other countries. I think there has been some discussions on that. So, for instance, bring in line, for instance, from Australia to Singapore to Indonesia, and of course that's something that could be quite beneficial if that electricity. So essentially, I mean, every time that you have a generator, of course, when we talk about regional grids and exchange, it means that you, on average, for the entire region, you are reducing costs, right? So that means that electricity coming from any countries, for instance, Australia, plus transmission cost must be cheaper than something that you have available along that region. So if that's something that could be achievable, of course, that is quite welcome. Not necessarily, I think these let's say non-Asian country needs to be part of the Asian power grid or the Asian power grid framework. Of course, you can have let's say a different framework, or for instance, a bilateral between a country from externally and a country in Asia. Well, a very already ongoing example on that, there is this the Mekong, how do you call that? The Mekong agreement, where you essentially have northern countries from Asia, plus southern provinces from China, and there has been already quite of a progress there, and also in terms of grid codes. So they've been trying to align those codes there and the way that you exchange power, and by grid codes we mean the way that those generators need to connect, and they need the way that they would need to behave in those power systems. Then the other question, I think it was about exporting, importing electricity there. So the point there is that those countries, they all can contribute to the Asian grid in different ways. They all have very nice resources. One of the examples that I put there, it was that you see in the northern part of the Asian grid, you see some storage resources being nicely complemented, for instance, with solar resources. So, for instance, you could very clearly see some solar generation during the day in places like Vietnam, but also, of course, if you go south, you would have also a strong solar generation in, for instance, Sumatra and Nusa Tenggara. These are all regions with very good solar potential. And then at the same time, you see, and you can clearly see when you track it at the hourly basis, those solar resources being balanced out by storage resources. For storage, we see in the next 10 years a very good relevance for hydropower resources or hydropower reservoirs, balancing these solar and wind generation. And then from 2030, 2035, then more and more batteries and other storage technologies will likely be more cost competitive. So essentially, the next 10 years, reservoirs still doing these storage role, and then batteries and other storage technologies going forward.
Thank you very much, Dr. Miranda. I think you really gave some concise and informative answers to those interesting questions. Now we'll move on to some questions for Mr. Ioannis. So the first question is, does the Ukraine war result in the expansion of nuclear power in Europe? And what is the potential of nuclear energy compared to other renewable energy there? And the second question is whether there's an ENTSO-E equivalent in Asia or Southeast Asia, or are there any plans for one?
I mean, quickly, the second one, I'm not familiar. In the past, we have been talking with some organizations that they try to create some sort of level of cooperation among the countries, but I wouldn't call it equivalent to ENTSO-E. Because ENTSO-E is really formed by an EU regulation with specific tasks, mandates, there are obligations and so on. So from that perspective, I'm not aware of anything equivalent. Now on the first part, Maybe starting with a small disclaimer, just not to give the impression of whichever answer I will give that support or not support nuclear. So from the TSO's perspective, the technology is also a bit irrelevant. Why I'm saying that is because the TSOs need and they have the obligation to operate the grid, whatever it is connected there. So starting with that, either that is nuclear or fully renewables or a mixture of all the different things. So the choice of technology is obviously driven very much by the political will and the goals of the region, the country, the union, whatever that is. Now, the specifics, to my awareness, the war in Ukraine has delayed, if I may put it in this way, the plans of some countries to decommission nuclear. Officially or unofficially, they put people in second thoughts, obviously, in order to ensure that there will be a proper security of supply from that. Now, on the overall political level, there is no EU stand against the nuclear, right? So there have been countries, like as we all know, like Germany, that they have their own national plans on decommissioning nuclear or other types of technologies. There are certain plans actually from other countries to decommission all technologies or old nuclears or inflexible nuclear technologies, something that cannot fit, for instance, to the new setting of requiring also flexibility from all types of units and so on, or upgrading old units and so on and so forth. So there have been such kind of plans. For new, completely new plants, yes, I think in the media there have been around Europe, I think, plans for, I don't know, like around 10 different units spread around Europe, I would say. But personally, I haven't noticed like a trend of refocusing on nuclear necessarily out of it. Yeah, I hope it answers the question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ioannis. Indeed, there is the development of nuclear power plants in Indonesia and potentially in the Philippines, so it does have a lot of relevance for Southeast Asia. Now we will move on to Mr. Akbar. So the first question is, what are the top 3 factors that will effectively lead to the ASEAN to make the ASEAN power grid a reality before 2030? And the second question is, who are the stakeholders that must be convened in step 1, which is the progressive coordination in your slide? And also, where are we now in terms of step 4 roadmap?
Thank you very much for the information. I think I can answer the question by one. First being what are the 3 factors that will effectively lead the FPG into implementation before 2030. Yes, this is something that has to do with the commitment from the ASEAN member states, especially for the Ministerial of the Energy, and then give the directives to each utilities of the ASEAN member states to pursue the interconnection project to be in place before the 2030. First is being the strong commitment of the intergovernmentals as well as the cooperation among the member states. And the second factor, perhaps the opportunity to conduct the feasibility study of the projects, because it will open the opportunity for the utilities to have a bankable document to seek the funding for their projects, because the project itself should be assessed on the technical level that it is feasible, as well as the economically it also provide the utility some cash or revenues, as well as commercially visible, as well as in the legal and regulatory framework. It has no issue to pursue the interconnections, and that is the second factor. The third factor is perhaps the acceptance of the public itself on the interconnection project, because it says that the ASEAN mainly consists of the developed countries, where the developing countries where the energy sovereignty is still the energy sovereignty issue still quite heavy to provoke with the energy connectivity, and this is something that should be able to address, to accept the energy connectivity, to allow more resource sharing to each other, and without any rejection from the public. And then the second question is regarding the stakeholders. On my earlier presentation regarding the convening stakeholders to have the progressive decision making. These stakeholders will mainly are the political people, as well as the ministerial on the Ministry of the Energy, as well as the utilities. Will also have the authority to decide the when and what to do the interconnections between the countries, as well as ASEAN itself as the intergovernmental organization would play as a catalyst to advocate the energy connectivity among the ASEAN member states. The stakeholder itself also will be involving the external organizations, such as the development partners, who will also be calling for their technical as well as the financial resource to do the feasibility study and so on. And then lastly, the developer investor will the one who will provide the funding resource for the interconnection projects. And that's the second question. I'm not sure what is the third question. Could you remind me, Bill?
No, I think there were just two questions, Mr. Akbar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your responses. So we're almost out of time. So I would just like to thank all the participants and also, of course, the speakers for giving their time and sharing some of their insights on energy integration. We learned a lot from a global perspective, from a European perspective, as well as an ASEAN perspective on grid integration. Certainly a lot of challenges, but a lot of positive examples to learn from each other. So before ending, I would just like to request our audience to participate in our upcoming 2023 Southeast Asia Climate Outlook Survey. So this is a survey that we undertake every year. And it essentially collects the perceptions of Southeast Asians on climate change. And your insights would be really, really useful in trying to understand what the threats are in terms of climate change and what policies need to be undertaken. So we will share a QR code that you can use, and it's open to all Southeast Asian citizens. And we will also share the link in our chat box. So if you can kindly just use up the, I think they would share the screen very soon, as well as the chat box, the link in the chat box. Sorry, we're just waiting for the, there you go. So we can use the QR code to get the survey, and you can also click on the link in our chat box, and it just takes a maximum of 7 to 10 minutes. It'll be very useful for us, and we can represent your views better in our publication. So thank you very much, everybody. Once again, Dr. Raul Miranda, Mr. Ioannis Theologitis, and Mr. Akbar Wahyono. Thank you for your time. We really appreciate it, and we hope to keep you in touch and update you on our studies, and hope you can also update us on the progress you make. And thank you very much to the audience for your time and for your interest in our programs. And I hope you managed to sign up to our email chains, and hopefully you can also answer our surveys. Thank you very much, and hope to see you all again soon.